Okay, so this is a short video on Mrs. H psychology on social influence, the obedience topic. What we're going to do is I'm going to talk you through a mind map, how to create a mind map summarizing all of this. So our starting point is just showing you what the mind map will eventually look like, something like this. Okay, don't worry that it's a little bit unclear at the moment. I'm going to talk you through each section, but roughly we're going to have a definition, we're going to have factors affecting, explanations, evaluation, ethics and methodology, other studies in real life, and dispositional factors all on here. So our starting point is going to be the factors affecting. Remember, these are just situational factors affecting, as opposed to down here the dispositional factors. So let's see what we've got. So what you need to do is on your mind map, there are 6. We need the key term, and we want to try and add in a little bit of detail, and of course we need the percentages. So if you just pause the video for a moment and see how many of these you can recall on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard, and then we'll proceed. Okay, so I'm going to run through them. The key factor, number 1, was status, in other words represented by the location. How do we get that? Well, it was at Yale University. We had the experimenter in a white lab coat, and what we found was 65% obeyed, went all the way up to 450 volts. Second one, the proximity. Proximity is important. Proximity of the teacher in this case to the learner, i.e. the teacher to the victim. Right? In Milgram's case, it's when they can actually see them as well as hear them. So in the first scenario, they could only hear Mr. Wallace, the actor, the Confederate. When they brought Mr. Wallace, the learner, into the room, so the naive participant could actually see them, the obedience dropped down to 40%. Following on to that is when you are actually doing the harm. So forcing, in Milgram's case, it was forcing his hand onto the shock plate. Then it dropped down to 30%. Next one was social support to disobey. It's important you say to disobey. In this case, the obedience dropped all the way down to 10%. And that scenario, if you remember, they had 2 Confederates. One dropped out at 150 volts, the other one at 210 volts, and only 10% proceeded all the way to 450 volts. Next one was someone else doing the dirty work for you, so shifting responsibility. And in that case, the naive participant was only reading the word pairs, somebody else was flicking the switches to give the electric shock, and obedience went all the way up to 92.5%. And finally, we had proximity of the experimenter to the teacher. So when the experimenter, the person in the lab coat, leaves the room and instructions were given over the telephone, it went all the way down to 20.5%. And as you know, the naive participants were even lying about the switches and clearly were uncomfortable about giving the shocks. We should also, at this point, give a little definition of obedience. So if you want to pause and just see whether you can recall it. So we're going to define it as complying with the demands of a perceived authority figure. You're complying because you don't necessarily agree with it. Demands because it's not a request. This is somebody in higher authority to you, so somebody higher in the hierarchy. And they don't even have to be somebody in authority. It's just somebody you perceive to be. Okay, so that's our definition that we are going to learn. So if you add that in now. We could also add in things like Milgram's original hypothesis, you know, that the Germans were different, so they were testing to see whether American citizens would be as obedient. And remember, Milgram was Jewish by descent, and therefore he was interested in this post-Second World War. So now we go on to our next part of the mind map, which is the explanations for it, and the 2 that you're required to know about. So we've got agency theory, split into the autonomous and the agentic state. And we've also got perception of a legitimate authority. So let's start with the agentic state, agency theory, split into these two. So autonomous state is obviously where you take responsibility for yourself. So anything in which you are more autonomous, we are assuming you're going to take more responsibility and less likely, for example, to do harm. Agency or agentic state is where you are effectively an agent for someone else. So you can claim they made me do it, or that's what you're trying to claim. So what you need to know is which of Milgram's scenarios put people more, or were people more likely to be in the autonomous state, and which were more likely to be in the agentic state. So if you pause the video, just see what you can recollect of this first. So obviously those in the autonomous state are less likely to be obeying, to do harm in this case. So they're going to be the scenarios where there are low percentages. So if you remember correctly, we've got things like someone else refusing to continue, so where you've got the social support to disobey, and if you remember that dropped down to just 10%. We had where you can see the victim, so it drops down to 40%. We have where you have to do the actual dirty work, force their hand, drops down to 30%. Another scenario is where the experimenter, the authority, leaves the room and gives orders over the phone, and it drops down to 20.5%. So various different scenarios, each of them making somebody realize that they have choice and that they are responsible. On the other hand, we have the agentic state. So if we run through those. So with the agentic state, there are various things. We could also include the gradual shift. Milgram had them going from 15 volts, just in small increments, 15 volts, 30 volts, 45 volts, and so on. And that made a difference. That's the kind of foot in the door technique. So we had that as one scenario. Another one is when somebody else is actually doing the dirty work, so you feel you can deny responsibility. And remember, that went up to 92.5%. We also have when the stooge, the actor, is behind a screen, we can't see the dirty work. And remember, in the original scenario where he's behind the screen, we have 65%. We also have prompts, the experimenter telling them that they'll take responsibility, and so on and so forth. So various options there. We also need to cover this perception of legitimate authority. How did Milgram create that? Well, we know it was at Yale University, very prestigious university. We also know that they created this sense of authority with somebody being in a lab coat. And that, again, automatically, as we see with other studies, gives the idea that there is somebody in authority there. So the next area we're going to explore is research that supports these ideas, these factors that affect. And so if we look at our third one, we're going to include this area, other studies and real life cases. So the first of these is the Bickmans Study. So if you remember the Bickmans Study, if you want to just pause the video, have a think about what that was about, for those of you who've done that extension work. Bickman was looking at streets of New York, and he had different people dressed in different, same person to standardized. And what Bickman found was he standardized it with the same person, sometimes in a guard uniform, sometimes in civilian dress. And they also did a scenario with the milkman's uniform. What they found was double the amount. Now, you might find different texts saying different percentages. Most of the texts I've seen have said it's roughly about 40%, around 40% in civilian, around 80% in the guard, and almost negligible. Hardly anyone obeyed the milkman. The requests or the orders they were given were to either pick up some rubbish, some paper bags, or give a coin to a stranger to use for the machine. So that's Bickman, and basically it's showing the power of the uniform. The second one we've got is Hoffling, which, as you know, was done in a hospital, and nurses were basically 21 out of 22 nurses broke 4 hospital rules. You don't need all the info, but basically they had instructions over the phone from an unknown doctor. They used a drug that wasn't on the ward list. They gave twice the maximum dose of the drug as well, and they shouldn't have taken orders from an unknown doctor over the phone. So 21 out of the 22 nurses actually obeyed. What was great about that was obviously it had high ecological validity because it was a real life setting. Obviously they didn't really administer the drug. It was a stooge and a placebo. But so it was a real life setting, high ecological realism, high mundane realism. It is the real world. It is a genuine hospital setting. Not so great was the fact that they obeyed, but actually what happened was that they ended up changing hospital practices to ensure that nothing like that would be able to happen again. So very powerful piece of research. Third one, Judoka. So Judoka was an interesting study. This was actually a student of Milgram's trying to get around the problem of deception. I gave them 36 quinine-soaked biscuits. And even though this was hideous for the participants to participate in, they were retching, they were almost sick with it because it was disgusting. It was clearly unpleasant for them. They all ate the 36 biscuits. So, and basically what that shows is that participants are obedient because they just accept the experimental situation as real. Okay. It was illustrating the situation, and the authority will get people to obey even if it's really unpleasant. You have also down here, if you had time, you could include a real life case. So these include My Lai, the aeroplane accidents, and the young lad Jowett as well, which are all very tragic situations, but they show the power of obedience. Okay. Our next part of the mind map is on the evaluation, and we're going to deal with the ethics first of all. So we've got the 3 ethical issues. There are more, but these are probably the top 3. Let me just run through those quickly. So if you want to pause and just think them through and see what you've got. First of all, we've got deception. So you need to be able to state where the deception was. So here we've obviously got deception in that they didn't realise that the actor was a stooge. They thought they were both, the naive participant thought that they were both naive participants. And also they were told that the investigation was about the effects of punishment on learning whereas it was actually about obedience. Secondly, protection from harm. Obviously, the naive participants were very distressed about the situation. We've got evidence of that. We see it on the original clip. And they should be protected. They should be in the same state when they leave as they are when they arrive. And with deception, we should say that we shouldn't deceive them because they lose faith in authority. So it's important for you to be able to say why there's a problem. Protection, they should leave in the same state that they arrive. And the right to withdraw, they should always have the right to get up and go and withdraw from it. So our main critic here is a woman called Diana Baumrind. And we just have a quick look and we'll run through the problems with it. She's stating all of those factors are issues with this. And we have Milgram's counter consideration, his replies to these. So in terms of deception, she says they were deceived. And he says, without that deception, we couldn't have done the research. He also went on to debrief afterwards, a year later, debrief, and 84% of them, was when they'd found out what it was all about, were actually very glad to have taken part. 75% said they'd learned something very useful. So although, yes, there was some deception, he said without it we couldn't continue with the research. In terms of protection from harm, first thing obviously is that nobody anticipated that would happen. Less than 1% of his colleagues and his students thought anybody would go to 450 volts. And so without that, if they hadn't, there would not have been any protection from harm. So again, it was a bit of a surprise for them. So we've got that we can include, but also He said that he had he'd given them a psychiatric examination a year later, and the independent psychiatrist had found no long-term harm with any of those individuals. Thirdly, with the right to withdraw, he said that obviously by the very fact that they are just remaining and continuing with it is the whole point of the experiment. Without that, by persuading them to remain, he's demonstrating the power of those authority figures. And he said they were not physically detained. 35% proved that by walking away from it. So our next mind map area is the other evaluation in terms of methods, methodology. So occasionally you'll see an exam question that talks about the ethics and the methodology discussion of both of those areas. So we're going to hone in here on internal validity, external validity, and within that, mundane realism, generalizability. Okay. So we'll start with the internal validity. Internal validity, remember, you need to state or be able to state. Internal validity is, does it test what it claims to test? Okay, so is it actually testing obedience? So two critics, Orn and Holland, have questioned that, and they think it's possibly a test of the naive participants' acting skills, and it's not really testing obedience at all. Their question was, why would the naive participant, well, surely they would realize that they're taking part in an act. How would they not realize that? Why would they not think the experimenter could be flicking the switches? So there is a criticism that surely they would have sussed that it was a whole act. However, to counter that, Milgram said he believed they genuinely did believe they were giving real shocks. He gave them a debrief, and on a scale of 1 to 14, they said they believed, 14 being that they believed it, they all said they believed it. Also, he asked them a year later, and 80% of them thought it was real, that they were actually genuinely giving shocks. So that was his feedback for that. In terms of external validity, the mundane realism, does it reflect the real world? Is this similar to what would be going on in the real world? And the criticisms are that that's not what we're asked to do in the real world, that it isn't true to life. However, others obviously have criticized that criticism and said, of course, it's like the real world. Things like this are happening every decade. We do have Nazi Germany, we've got Abu Ghraib, we've got events in Rwanda and Syria. People are told to do destructive, terrible things and given a plausible reason for doing it. And therefore, actually, one could argue that it has very high mundane realism in these extreme cases. Third one is about external validity in terms of generalizing. How far can we generalize from this research? Well, there are criticisms over cultural differences, gender differences, and historical validity. So if we take these one at a time, cultural differences, if we are to be able to generalize this in terms of culture, we should find all nations all across the world, we should have similar percentages. And there's some discussion about that. And they seem to vary. So, for example, in some of the research, for example, in Holland, Austria, Germany, some of the research had found higher obedience, but lower in the UK and in Australia. But there is a criticism of that because they were not testing exactly the same thing, and therefore we really can't compare those cultures. So that is still in debate. In terms of gender, again, we should be able to say, these findings should apply to males and females. Remember that predominantly Milgram used males certainly in his first batch, and we need evidence of how females will behave. And other research has shown other factors, other results. Let me just remind you of a couple of those studies. For example, out of Milgram's original 636 participants, He only apparently included 40 females. So we could question that on its own. But the other one that's really of interest is the Sheridan and King research, where puppies were used instead of human participants, and used with females, and they had 100% obedience level with the females and the puppies. The puppies obviously were not really hurt. They were given small shock to make them squeal. But the women, obviously, in the same as in the Milgram case, they thought they were genuinely giving shocks. And then finally, we have the question of historical validity, so, or otherwise known as temporal validity. So again, we should be able to apply this today. Question is, this was done in the 60s in America, and would we find the same results today? And in fact, obviously, we've got real life cases, but there is more up-to-date research as well if you want to do some extension work. And finally, our final part of this side of our mind map are the dispositional factors. Remember, we need to look at obedience having situational factors causing and possibly dispositional factors. So you guys, if you have already made your notes, you should have that this research was led by somebody called Adorno, and it's talking about the authoritarian personality. Cause of this personality supposedly from very harsh, very punitive parenting, and characteristics of these people are that they are more obedient to those in higher authority, so higher in the hierarchy, but actually they're more disparaging of people lower down them in the hierarchy. They are also more conformist. Okay, so we could include this in questions of conformity as well. However, as you know, you need to have some evaluation of this. So one of the evaluator points is that obviously in Nazi Germany, you couldn't have a whole nation who had this authoritarian personality type. Also, we could have aspects that, for example, it's correlational research. So, and you'll learn if you haven't already, that correlations do not show a causal link. So there is a problem with that. It's just showing that there is a relationship, not a cause between one thing or another. So in other words, the authoritarian personality does not cause somebody to be more obedient. And remember, Adorno's research was using, being assessed on something called the F scale, F for fascism. And so the criticism here is that they would all be very extreme right-wing, but we can also have obedience, very extreme obedience that's left-wing, and therefore it's Adorno's theory is quite limited. Okay, it doesn't account for the whole spectrum. So there is our mind map and our mind map summary. We will go on to resistance, disobedience, defiance, and that will be our next little mind map.